two more presenters than our final round table, as I mentioned before. So already on stage is Jodi from Markel International. So welcome to the stage.
Thank you. So just a brief further introduction to me. I'm the lead recruitment business partner for Markel International. Markel International is part of a bigger group, which is Markel Corporation. So we're US owned. I run our permanent recruitment across our UK business, and Markel International also spans across international countries across Europe, Asia, Canada, and so on. So it's a very, very big group of companies. Before we get started with my presentation, I'd just like to put a few questions out actually through Slido. So I'm going to be talking to you today about diversity and inclusion, and more specifically around building diverse talent pools. So before we get started, it would be interesting to know from the room, how advanced is your D&I strategy within your organisation today? I have a second question, but I'll pause there while we collect some answers. I'll come round so I can see. Quite heavily weighted at the top, which hopefully means I can give you some good insights today. Some quite advanced, which would be interesting to hear some of your thoughts as part of the wider discussions later on. Okay, that looks pretty still. So let's move on to the second question. So I'd also like to know, how much involvement do you personally have in your company's D&I strategy? Again, it'll be interesting to hear later on what that involvement is and what ownership sits within your recruitment functions. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to make a start. Before I start presenting, I've got a short video clip to play to you, and I'll hit play on that now. So it's going to be a couple of minutes with this, and I'll explain the context of this afterwards. So how many of you, just out of interest with a raise of hands, have heard and seen news about the Lloyds Culture Survey? I thought that might be the case. I was keen to play this to you just as a reminder of the current challenges facing Lloyds of London and the wider market, and the importance of the discussion around diversity and inclusion. So I'm going to lead on to talk. Oh, it's playing again. Sorry. I think I just need to click here. Okay, so what am I going to talk to you about today? So diversity and inclusion, the business case. So why is there a genuine business case around diversity and inclusion beyond the fact that it is the right thing to do? To give you some ideas and share some of my experience of what leading organisations are doing and what best practice looks like. Some experience hire strategies that you may be able to implement into your recruitment processes to help build those diverse talent pools. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing at Markel around diversity and inclusion and what our agenda is. So first and foremost, diverse teams, and why are these important? It's a fact that diverse teams bring different experiences, different perspectives, and different approaches to solving complex and sometimes non-routine business problems. How I like to describe that is diversity of thought. It's really important. Having a diverse team also better enables your organisation to engage with a diverse customer base and to reflect your customers. That can increase productivity, it can increase sales, and it increases your brand awareness. I think it's really important to note that none of this can be enabled or made possible without an inclusive culture and a leadership team that lead in an inclusive way. So if I come on to the nuts and bolts of the business case and how diversity and inclusion can actually impact the bottom line and revenue brought into your organisation. So I'll draw your attention to this report by McKinsey & Co, Delivering Through Diversity. It was published in 2017. There are some really interesting findings here. So firstly, companies in the top quartile for gender diversity on their leadership and executive team are 21% more likely to outperform on profitability and 27% more likely to have superior value in creativity than companies that are in the bottom quartile. The third box is telling us that companies that reflect these stats in regards to ethnicity are more likely to have 33% more likely to have industry-leading profitability. The next point I want to talk about is innovation, and this is something that will come out throughout the presentation as well. So Boston Consulting Group published a report as well in 2017 around how diverse leadership teams boost innovation. And this is telling us that companies that reported above average diversity on their management teams were able to report innovation revenue at 19 percentage points higher than those without. So I think that clearly sets out the genuine business case around diversity and inclusion, which I'd like to elaborate on more broadly than the facts and figures. So how can D&I improve business performance holistically? Firstly, we've talked about diversity of thought, and this impacts the quality of decision making and ability to make quality decisions within your business. We've mentioned innovation and customer insights and customer engagement. I think innovation is clearly a hot topic today, talking about technology and building technology into our recruitment processes, but also there's a changing landscape in the workplace and our markets around automation and lots of things happening in the world today that mean that we need to continue to stay ahead. So one of the things that a lot of insurance companies are moving towards at the moment is digitalised platforms to engage with their customers. So it's thinking about what talent do we need in our business to drive these innovations. Employee satisfaction, this is really, really critical to retention. So this is what has already been talked about a lot today, is culture from top down in a business is critical, and employee satisfaction is really, really key to retaining the talent that you bring into your organisation. I've mentioned image and brand. Having a workforce that reflects your customer base will naturally improve your image and brand, and from a recruitment perspective will raise the profile of your employer brand, which I'll talk more about later. And that all of this enables you to be in a position to win the war on talent. I think it's fair to say that we're operating in similar markets, and therefore probably in a lot of cases are in the market looking for similar talent that are in high demand. So how do you position yourself as an employer of choice and ensure that you can attract and retain that talent? So moving on to some ideas around leading organisations, what they're doing and what best practice looks like. The first point that I want to talk about, which Paul, you referred to earlier, which I think underpins everything subsequently being successful, is culture and buy-in from the top down. This needs to be from the exec and the board layer of the business and needs to be driven through every level of the organisation. Firm-wide strategy and targets, and this is a difficult one for a lot of organisations, because before you can get to a point of setting a strategy around D&I, you need to know your current workforce, and you need to have really robust data around who exists in your workforce today to be able to establish if and where are the gaps, so you can set meaningful targets, not just for your recruitment process, but also for your talent pipelines internally. Recruitment D&I champions, I'm not sure how many of you within your functions may have these roles existing out of interest, from a show of hands. So not many. So I've seen this work really well, and it can vary depending on the size of your recruitment team, whether you have more than one D&I recruitment champion, or if you have a smaller team and you allocate that role to one person. It gives accountability within the recruitment function to ensure that you stay ahead in terms of knowing what this D&I best practice looks like and how you can drive that through your whole function and throughout the business in their recruitment processes. It's an opportunity to share that knowledge and share that best practice as widely as possible, and also to give those people accountability to call out when they see that things are not being done in the right way. Returnship programs, something that's quite prevalent, particularly in the professional services and some of the larger financial services organisations. So you might have heard about some of those. What this does essentially is it addresses the mid-career gap in organisations. It's not exclusively aimed at women, but it is often women that leave the workplace at that mid-level management part of their career naturally to have families. However, these programs can be targeted at anyone that's been subject to a gap in employment, anywhere usually between around 2 to 10 years. It offers a structured program to bring these people back into the workplace so that they can grow their confidence to re-enter the workplace, and you get an opportunity to assess whether they are ultimately right to be employed full-time. So it's not a guaranteed route back in, there's still an assessment process, but it gives opportunity to people that would often be turned away at CV review with the unconscious biases around gaps in employment. Career Watch and Future Leaders programs for diverse colleagues is something that I learnt about in professional services in my time at EY. This was an initiative that identified high potential diverse talent within the organisation and gave them access to mentors and coaches, often the people that would be directors or heads of their functions, that would be able to coach and mentor them to ensure that they were ready if there was opportunity to go for other roles in the organisation or promotion, to make sure that they were in the best possible place to raise their profile. And that's really about building those talent pipelines to ultimately impact the level of diversity at a leadership level. Established inclusion networks. These can also be referred to as diversity and inclusion networks. Some organisations choose to have specific networks for specific strands of diversity. For example, you often hear about a women's network, an ethnicity network. Some organisations may have one whole inclusion network, which I'll come on to talk about more later on. The purpose of these networks is to drive a sense of belonging amongst your workforce, but also as recruiters, we can really leverage this, because if you build and identify your groups of diverse colleagues in your workforce, how can you utilise those networks for things like referrals, for example? So this leads me on nicely to talk in a bit more detail about what you can actually implement in your recruitment processes and some tools that you can use to attract more diverse candidates. I've referenced early careers, but I'm not going to spend too much time talking about early careers. The focus is going to be more on experience hire. Just briefly around early careers, I think quite a lot has been done at this level, particularly around removing specifications for top universities, which has significantly increased the diversity of candidates coming into organisations. conversations at grassroots levels. I think there's been a lot of success as well trialling blind CVs and resumes, which has been successful. But let's talk about experienced hires and what that looks like. So firstly, brand and marketing. This has been something that's come up quite a lot through discussions today, and the importance of your employer brand and perception of your brand, and I've touched on that as well. I think this is using your brand and marketing as a more strategic tool. So, for example, do you have diverse colleagues in your workforce today that you can build profiles and case studies around? That could be somebody who works with a disability, who has access to flexible working. It could be somebody who works in your business as a carer, who's given the flexibility to perform their role. It could really be anybody who fits a diverse category. And it's about working on building those case studies and then sharing those to build your employer brand. So, for example, you could share them on your careers site. You could also push them out through various social media channels. And as I say, it increases the awareness of your brand and builds a perception of your organisation being an inclusive employer. Partnerships is really important. So we all work with agencies and have preferred suppliers. And I think it's really important to challenge those suppliers and ask them what they're doing around diversity and inclusion, and whether they have a strategy, and what are they doing to support you in attracting diverse candidates. You could look at potentially mandating them on 50-50 shortlists for gender, for example, if you wanted to. But I think it's more about holding them accountable to make sure that all the efforts that you're putting in as an in-house team aren't lost when it comes to your third parties. Process. This is really touching on everything end to end. So first and foremost, are you able to capture information for the candidates that are coming into your pipelines and subsequently joining your business? And this is around declarations and disclosures. So can you capture ethnicity? Can you capture gender? Could you capture disability? I think that's really important to build the bigger picture about who's coming into your workforce. The second thing I want to touch on there is job descriptions, and reviewing our job descriptions to ensure that they are as inclusive as possible when it comes to the languages we use and how those are positioned. There are many facts and figures to show that diverse candidates, particularly female candidates, will quite quickly rule themselves out of a role based on a job description if they don't hit 100% of the criteria. So it's about being creative with how you position your role profiles. And there's a lot of technology available in the market today that's quite accessible to be able to do this. One of them that I know about is Textio, which you may or may not have heard of, but they offer free trials, so it's worth even having a look just to see what that looks like and how that can decode your job descriptions. Paul, you've touched on this, unconscious bias training, which absolutely should be mandatory for all recruitment managers, hiring managers, to ensure that they remain objective in their interview processes, and ideally that they remain objective throughout the whole end-to-end process. And educating people around unconscious bias and what this means, I think, is also really important. The next point is around your interview process, going one step further around diverse interview panels. It's really important, if you're engaging with and attracting diverse candidates, that you give them the best possible view of your organisation. For example, if you have a female candidate in process, you should absolutely strive for them to meet another female within your organisation, ideally within the interview process, but sometimes that's not possible. There might be functions within the organisation where there aren't many females. So it's about being more creative. And could they have a peer-to-peer meeting with somebody informally outside of the process? Or is there another senior female role model within your business that could engage with that candidate? And it genuinely does make a difference. I have seen one example in my career where we had a really, really strong female candidate for a senior technology role, and she turned down an offer because she had met male leaders throughout 2-3 stages of the interview process, and the only female she met was in HR, and it didn't give a good reflection of the organisation. So I think that's really critical. Final point, which might spark some debate for later on, is the concept of prioritising diverse candidates. Depending on your recruitment volumes, you might be attracting hundreds of candidates in your pipelines. It's about identifying those diverse candidates and prioritising them through to your hiring managers, and ideally through to interview process, to ensure that they get an opportunity. Sourcing. Paul, you and I had a discussion just a moment ago around how recruiters are measured. Often the case is that we have metrics, and one of those key metrics is time to hire. However, if you're measured on time to hire, it's incredibly unlikely that you're going to impact diversity in your pipelines, because we know that it takes time to unearth diverse talent, and we have to think outside the box to be able to find these candidates in the market. And secondary to that, it often takes longer to engage with diverse candidates, particularly female candidates. In my experience, take longer to be comfortable to want to enter a recruitment process. So it's giving your recruiters the time that it takes to be able to go and do that. And also training. I think it's easy to assume that speaking to diverse candidates is simple, but it's not always. I think we need to make sure that recruiters are trained to have conversations with candidates. For example, with a disability, how confident would you be to talk to that candidate about their disability? So it's training and upskilling your recruiters to be confident. Also, this kind of impacts the bit around partnerships, because similarly with your agencies, if you're driving them on speed, they won't be able to achieve that either. So that brings me nicely on to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing at Markel and some of the priorities that we're taking around diversity and inclusion. And it's fair to say that we're on quite a journey with this. Firstly, I want to draw your attention to the Global D&I Steering Group. This has only just been established in July this year. The purpose of this group is to determine a group-wide D&I strategy and to drive that strategy throughout the whole corporation. So this D&I steering group has representation across our multiple international regions, all at MD level and above, with the idea of driving that culture from the top down, as we've heard is really important today. As I say, that's a relatively new group, so it'll be really interesting over coming months and years to see how that evolves. So speaking of culture, Markel style. So I want to talk to you about the Markel style. This is essentially the principles and the values that we hold around attracting and retaining our talent. And it's a culture that is driven through the whole organisation. I think what's really important here is this is something that's driven through the whole business and not just owned by HR. So when it comes to D&I, this is interwoven through all of our business priorities to ensure that that ownership and that accountability sits across the whole organisation. Just briefly, the Markel style is underpinned by 5 key pillars. One of those is D&I. One is well-being. Then we have community, innovation and recognition. And all of those pillars have board and senior level sponsorship. The key to this is creating a culture where everybody's voice can be heard and everybody can be themselves and be comfortable to be themselves at work. So data, metrics and targets. I mentioned earlier that the key to building a firm-wide strategy around D&I is data and knowing your existing workforce. And this is a journey that we are on at the moment. So we've got a strategy in place, which is going to start with 2 key strands of diversity, which is gender and ethnicity. The plan is to establish the gaps in our workforce under those 2 categories, which will then filter down into setting tangible targets for our recruitment process and our attraction strategy to fill those gaps. But also, again, looking at talent pipelining internally and how we develop people that are within our business today. Inclusive leadership training. I referenced earlier that diverse teams and what they can deliver is not possible without an inclusive culture and an inclusive leadership team. It's something that we're striving for throughout our business. So we've just rolled out workshops to our top 50 leaders internationally. And those workshops educated those leaders on diversity and inclusion and got them thinking about their biases and how that could impact their ability to lead in an inclusive way. We need to go to phase 2, which is those top 50 leaders to cascade that training throughout their functions locally. So ultimately, that will go throughout our entire organisation to create a whole inclusive leadership culture. Recruiting right training is our mandatory training for unconscious bias that all recruiting managers have to go through, and it's a must before they enter any interview process. This doesn't just look at interviews, it looks at the whole end-to-end recruitment process, and it ensures that objectivity sits throughout that process. And lastly, inclusion network, which I referenced earlier. So we've been on an interesting journey with this because what we had is individual networks. For example, we had a women's network and we had ethnicity networks, and the feedback that we got from people within the organisation that didn't fit those categories of those networks was that they actually didn't feel that they could be part of them, so it almost had the opposite effect. And we wanted to create a place where everybody would feel confident to come and actually to attract then a bigger group of people. So those networks have been disbanded and we've created an inclusion network that takes a holistic view and covers all interest groups. That's currently run by the head of talent, but we're in the process of appointing a chair from the business side to lead and sponsor that network. But the initial feedback that we've had is really positive. So that brings me to the end, but I just wanted to reference again where I started and just give you a few things around the Lloyds of London market and what Lloyds of London are doing to address the problems. So we saw in the video big culture issues, big need to address these issues and to really continue to drive strategies around D&I. So I just wanted to make reference to some of the things that Lloyds are doing off the back of that to be proactive. So firstly, they've established now a quarterly meeting in the city that will have attendance from all HR director and talent directors across the Lloyds of London market. They had the first of those sessions in the last few weeks, which had some really good outputs, and it's creating a call to action across the market. Secondly, there's a questionnaire that's due to be rolled out to all managing agents that's going to question on specific policies, one of those being gender pay gap, and asking what's being done to address those gender pay gaps. There's also a new training programme that's going to be rolled out in 2020 by Lloyds of London, which is called Accelerate. It's the first programme that's going to target ethnic minorities, which is a really big step forward. And there's a huge, huge focus on well-being, which I think is really, really important. So that brings me to a close. So thank you. And any questions?
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thanks.